Claire.
Meg?
So I should begin by apologising about the seating, but I have an old rugby union injury that flared up. Well, I'm on the NRL board, so playing the wrong game. Flared up, but they say I'm too old to have a knee replacement. So part of that is I can't sit on high stools. Sorry, Claire. So we're
That's
seated.
okay. It's just when I sat on that high stool,
It looked a bit
like,
strange.
It felt like I was looking down on you, Megan, and that is something that, having worked with you and known you for a while, is absolutely impossible to ever do for all the reasons.
Claire. When we were organising this, I said to Claire, well, I rang you a couple of days ago and said, I suppose I should write a script. And she's like, no, let's wing it. Because when we get together, all we do is talk and talk and talk and talk. And this is a topic that's close to both of our hearts for different reasons. You've had a number of, or you will be having a number of book launches around the country, and each of your interlocutors will have different perspectives. But of course, I'm an Aboriginal person and a constitutional lawyer, and so this book was fascinating to me and remains fascinating. And I'm actually, Harvard Bookstore asked me to recommend a book in their next newsletter, and I'm like, recommending yours.
My dad, who is a Harvard graduate, will be very thrilled to hear that.
That's nice. Because it's such an important part of our democracy, and this is the week leading up to the referendum last year. And so some of my questions to Claire are oriented around that, obviously. But I wanted to begin by just saying it's such an extraordinary book. This is, especially for an Aboriginal person, the Yirrkala Bark Petitions were a series of petitions, but particularly the first one that we learned a little bit about in law school, not enough. But certainly as a constitutional lawyer who went on to teach it and practice it, it's become increasingly important. And I know you talk about it in the context of the trilogy. Sorry, I'm trying not to spit into the microphone, where you talk about flag, banner, bark, and this being a really integral part of Australian democracy. One of the things when you read your kind of introduction and you start, there's all sorts of things that jumped out of me. The first thing that jumped out of me was how you talked about the concept of time and how time is spoken about in a particular way in Western liberal democracy, Western societies, Western communities, in a way that's completely different to the community that you came upon, and you speak about how you did that and how you're adopted, and it's quite an extraordinary story actually. And so time is a really interesting concept, I think, that comes through in the book. That concept of Madigan and law and governance obviously is something that's at the kind of forefront of my mind when I read the book. Because the Yolngu and the work that they've done has pioneered law reform and change in this country. I mean, they are literally pioneers when it comes to First Nations peoples trying to figure out how to manage this legal system that's been imposed upon them. So I guess one of the first things I thought I'd ask you about is, in it you say, which I find really interesting, but I think it speaks a lot to the referendum last year. Yeah. You say, when people say, what finishes off the trilogy? Like, what's next? And you say the Yirrkala Bark Petitions, and people just blankly stare at you. And to me, I think that's interesting, because I think part of last year's referendum, when we look at the research leading into the final 6 weeks and the research afterwards, and we were talking about disadvantage and recognition and all of these things, but the nation just kind of blankly stared at us. And so that part of the book and that kind of reaction that you had when people actually don't know what the Bark Petitions are was really interesting to me, because when you look at that entire movement for the voice, its genesis was in the Bark Petitions. And it's like Australians don't even realise, because the research clearly shows that Aussies think that the voice idea came from politicians. They don't actually realise our mob have been trying to expand the notion of Australian democracy for decades and decades and decades to include us. That hasn't happened yet, but can we start there?
Yeah, okay. Meg, you've given me a lot of starting points there.
I know, I'm sorry.
I've got time, I've got governance, I've got adoption into community, I've got voice, consultation, and in this yarn, because that's what we said we'd basically just do is have a yarn, let's try to get to all of those. But I'll take as that starting point in the ping pong matches that is your big brain.
The blankness.
The blankness. The blank slateness of mainstream Australian, white Australian consciousness of an Aboriginal political past. And one of the things that I have certainly come across is this, as you say, these blank stares that I get when people ask me what my next book is, and then I have been saying it because I've been writing this book for 10 years. So it very much predates the constitutional referendum last year. It predates the concept or the idea of voice that's become a mainstream concept now, even though it wasn't accepted as a political construct. The idea of voice is much more in people's imaginations. The research for this book, the genesis of it, the way that the gift that was given to me by the Yolngu people in being essentially asked or empowered to write this story with them predates that. So it's funny how timing works in that it ends up looking like a political intervention in a sense, where in a way the whole trilogy has been revisionist, so of course it is a political intervention, but it looks like much more of a contemporary one rather than an historical revisionism that is setting the record straight. It now looks like, with the timing, that it's not only setting the record straight, but also playing an activist role in our future. Now, I would say, and I've been criticised for saying this, that all historians should and can, in one way, have a role to play in being an activist part of shaping our futures, because of the choice of the stories that we tell and whose perspective we tell them from, and the mode in which we tell them. So, for example, this book is written for a general audience as a narrative, page-turning, as it was described at the Yolngu launch in Yirrakala on Friday, as a whodunit. And because I start with that question at the beginning of the anecdote, Yolna Jal, which is what one of the Yolngu people, Dame Balapu, said in the summer of 1962, just before Christmas, when he saw these mining survey pegs that had been erected near the mission, and they hadn't been there that morning, and his words were Yol Naljal, that Yongomata, for who wants this? So in a way the book then becomes that. Truth-telling is, as you well know, Meg, an essential part of what the Uluru Statement for the Heart called for. Asked all Australians to come along with Aboriginal Australia in playing a role in. And obviously historians have a special role to play in that. And I think that the kind of documentary, archival and collaborative community research that I've done in this book will play a role in the sort of truth-telling that possibly can start to populate that blank slate with the stories that are, as you say, much more well known in Aboriginal Australia, that have been driving forces, that are inspirational stories like the Yolngu Bark Petitions, that have been they're so absent in white Australia's consciousness of its political past and the role of Aboriginal people in creating that political culture that we have now, this thing that we would call democracy. So one of the things that by the end of the book I gesture towards is the kind of what would now be considered to be the kind of Bruce Pascoe idea of the firsts. You know, that Dark Emu gave the idea that, or ran the thesis that First Nations people were our first farmers, the first people to engage in agriculture. And there's been that whole series the National Museum has done, first astronomers, first scientists. And I gesture towards the idea that maybe this gives us an opportunity to think of Yolngu people and other First Nations people by extension as our first politicians, our first, possibly even our first democrats, because of the collective decision-making processes that we're engaged in as part of Yolngu law since time immemorial. And the way in which terra nullius, which we understand as being a concept that relates to land and country, that the fiction of it being an empty land, there is also a kind of intellectual terra nullius that went on that has wiped Aboriginal culture, their slate clean of the idea of law and governance and political treaties and deal making that went on within Aboriginal culture. That this was already a land way before British law came, in which there were governance structures and legal structures that, in the case of Yirrkala, right up until 1963, no Yolngu person had ever considered weren't in operation. Because of the particular history of that place, it's only essentially 2 generations that since the frontier came to Yirrkala. And until those white pegs, and until the aftermath of those white pegs, no Yolngu person considered themselves any other than being a sovereign being on their sovereign land. So that idea that we say in our acknowledgements of country that sovereignty was never ceded, well, in Yirrkala, in northeast Arnhem Land, in Yolngu territory, it never was, and it still hasn't been, and it never will be.
And it's interesting too, because your new mob were really supportive of Uluru, but you never heard them saying our sovereignty will be ceded, because they knew that there was no act in the Australian Constitution that could cede their sovereignty. Can I just say though, so I don't think, I mean, I knew you before when this book was being produced, and we were doing lots of things together, including the Johnny Farnham You're the Voice ad for Uluru, but and I know there are suggestions that these kinds of histories are activist histories, but you read your author's note and then you jump straight into the history, and it's the most extraordinary forensic analysis of what happened in the lead up to the Bark Petition and everything that came after, of course. It's the kind of really nuanced, finely granular detail that all Australians need to know about how people become dispossessed of their land, but also the way in which the Australian Parliament ignores Aboriginal voices. I found the detail extraordinary in terms of just knowing things that I didn't know before about the first Bark Petition, and I think that's why the book is so amazing. But I have to say, some of your insights into Galarrwuy's, can I say Galarrwuy?
The family have given me permission for his name to be used in the book, and I asked when I was in Yirrkala last week whether I can say his name at launches, and they have said I can.
I used Dr. Yunupingu in the Wannabe lectures, but I found some of that insight no one has heard some of this before. And in particular in relation to the Milpram and Nabalco case, his particular calling out of the judge in that case was revelatory to me. Because sometimes, you read a lot of discussions and explanations around that case and the Yolngu kind of work in law reform and strategic litigation, and it can be very clinical, but it was really interesting to hear his anger towards the judge in the book.
So if I can just fill in a couple of things there. One is how I got to be sitting next to Galarrwuy to have these incredible insights into him. And secondly, just a quick timeline. So the Yirrkala Bark Petitions, of which there were 4, it's one of the things that my forensic research and the granular detail was able to uncover. And this is because I had exclusive access to a private archive that had never been used before, let alone discovered or known it existed. And I tracked down the son of Reverend Edgar and Anne Wells, who was the superintendent and his wife at the Yirrkala Mission in 1963, who was so central to the protest movement and to the facilitation. They were real allies of the Yolngu, the facilitation of the political protest that happened that year. I tracked down their son just by old-fashioned historical researchers in going through the phone book and cold calling people and saying, "Are you the Jim Wells who's the son of it?" Until I got the one who happened to live 15 minutes down the road from me in Melbourne. And so once we finally got out of lockdown, one of them, I was able to go to Jim and his wife Chris's house and work there for months inside an archive that he basically, once his dad had died, just closed the door on. He didn't know what was in it. Nobody had ever seen it. And let me tell you, Edgar Wells was waiting for his historian to come along. He's a bit like Manning Clark, who apparently in the pages of his own archives, he's left little notes to biographers on the side as to how he'd like certain things interpreted. It was almost like that, and there were a couple of times where I was saying, "Don't worry, Edgar, I'm here and I hear you." But because his wife Anne actually took contemporaneous notes about everything that was going, because Edgar and Anne understood that they were making history. They understood the risks that they were taking in doing so, but they knew what they were doing was going to be, in some way, paradigm shifting. And so they took copious notes. And one of the things that Anne did in her handwritten diary was to note down how many Bark petitions there were. And nobody had known that before. The internet is full of various speculations. Who the artists were, the process in which they had been painted, who they were sent to, each one of them was sent to, and how. Anne was the one who sent them. She was the one who typed them up on her typewriter. And that knowledge has led to a whole lot of outcomes, including me finding the 4th missing petition, which was in Derby, and in December last year, I facilitated the repatriation of that petition back to Yolngu country, and it is now at Yirrkala. But one of the things, I've lost my thread. This happens.
How you came to be sitting.
How I came to be sitting next to Gullaroo. Thank you, Susan. I had unique access to documentary archives, but I also had unique access to Yolngu community, because I had first gone to live there in 2010 for nothing to do with my work, and had been adopted in the Yolngu kinship, Gurutur system, into a family that happened to be Gullaroo's family. I was adopted by his 4th wife, and her children were the same age as my children. They were going to school together. And my relationship with her developed over the time we were there and continued after we left. And it wasn't until a few years later that Gullaroo kind of figured out that I did things other than sweep up and look after children and drive people around. He asked me what I did, and I said, "I'm an historian." And he said, "Oh, you tell stories. I tell stories too." And from that time, he sort of figured out that we could potentially tell stories together. And this is one of the ones that he wanted told. And that process developed over a period of years, but in particular, in another lockdown of the middle of 2021, I was in Yirrkala in northeast Arnhem Land for 9 weeks, and he wanted me to come and sit with him, and it was very specifically I had to sit with him because he only had one leg by this stage, in the home every day, and we spent an hour with the tape recorder on, with him telling me what he called Näku Dhäruk land rights boy, which in Yolngu Mata means my land rights story. And so it was through that process of daily interaction that a whole lot of Gullaroo's philosophy, his worldview, his history, his particular take on events. I now know what Gullaroo thinks about every Prime Minister he ever met. And he met them all. I can tell you who he thought was worth a pinch of shit, and the only one was Hawke. And he was not very fond of Whitlam, actually. And so, So there is a way in which I was able to access this very unique information. And then I was also able to talk to many other Yolngu elders, not just Gullaroo. It was the fact that I had been taken into that family that then gave me access to the whole Yolngu community. Because once you're adopted by one family, through the Gurutur system, you're related to everybody else. And so slowly, over time, over the process of, over 10 years of going back there constantly and sitting down with people and yarning, and then specifically having interviews and questions, including with the man who was the sole surviving signatory of the Bark Petitions. And he passed away, unfortunately, in March this year, but he was there to see the repatriation of the petition that he had signed 60 years earlier. And so I was able to get details from him, like where they actually sat to sign it, how the signatories who were chosen by the community, how the elders had chosen those particular people and for what reason. Now this is beyond a eureka moment for an historian. This is a gift. You know, this is an actual act of being able to work collaboratively and consultatively with the community about the story they want told, and at the same time to be able to give them back, because I was getting so much, and one of the things about Yolngu law is that there needs to be an exchange, which is one of the things that was so problematic about miners coming on, taking land and not giving anything back, because it broke Yolngu law. To be able to give their history back to them in all sorts of other ways, including finding that fourth petition.
It's interesting, and it comes up in the book, that notion of diplomacy and dialogue. And as I said, it is finely granular information for those who know about the Bark Petitions. And at some point, and I think probably through this book, we will get the nation to understand how important this is, how significant the Bark Petitions are to Australian democracy. Do you have any insights into that? Because I think, and it's in some ways it's returning to your first question, and I apologise everyone for jumping over straight into a lawyer's question about the first land rights case, which not we, but the Yolngu lost through the judge that I mentioned, but we can come back to that.
Oh yeah, that's the thing.
But we can come back to that, because I think when you do read it, it provides all of the background information that none of us knew.
Yeah.
None of us knew. I spent about an hour with Noel Pearson on the phone just before this. Nobody knew this detail. So this is new for Australian history. And I'll just also jump in and say, when we did the dialogues, the Uluru Statement from the Heart dialogues, our people spoke about Australian history, not truth-telling so much. And I think that in the post-Uluru environment, truth-telling has been picked up by technocrats and academics and overseas experts who've decided that that's how it should be done, through a truth commission. That is not what our people spoke about in dialogues. It's a really good example of how nobody listens to what our people say when we do this piece of work. They spoke about Australian history and Australian historians. They spoke about why would Aussies want to recognise us given they don't know anything about our history. And I said to you when I read this book, I was like, this is the beginning of the Uluru truth-telling history component. This book is the beginning of that. Not the commissions, but this book, because it does provide you, and as you say, well before the Uluru work, with really fascinating insights into, the mining companies, right? So you talk about the mining frontier. I found that fascinating because, of course, in the conversations across the country and the debates amongst mob around the Uluru Statement, you had the East Coast saying, we wouldn't mine, we don't support mining, you're funded by a mining company, we disregard you. And then you've got the rest of the mob who actually on a day-to-day basis have had to grapple with mining companies on their land for decades and decades and decades and decades.
Well, I think that was one of the really important things for me, and it was an intellectual shift for me in diving deep into this once I had made the decision that I was going to go there, was in really looking at the wording of the petition itself very closely and realising that the Yolngu were not protesting against mining per se.
No.
There was nothing in there that says we're against mining or you can't take these resources from our land. What they are saying is you can't come onto our land without consultation, and you cannot take resources from our land without compensation, because those two things fundamentally break Yolngu law. And the Yolngu were people who knew that and knew their rights to it and their rights and entitlements as a sovereign nation, because they'd been trading with Macassan fishermen for centuries. So, they already had within their historical knowledge, within their governance structures, within their jurisprudential systems, a whole corporate knowledge, let's say, of what they could expect from strangers or outsiders who came onto their land. We might call these things now free trade agreements or international trade agreements that they had with Macassan people. And the Macassan people treated with them, essentially, yes, we'll come and we'll take, but we will ask you for your permission and we will give you this in return. And then suddenly, here in 1963, there was these survey pegs, and then they discovered, Edgar Wells discovered, that there'd been a deal done in Sydney between the Methodist Overseas Mission that oversaw the missions in northeast Arnhem Land, the Menzies government, and the mining company that had had leases there since 1958 to excise 140 square metres from the miles from the Arnhem Land Reserve and give it to the mining company for leases, and that they were just going to start drilling. So the Yolngu weren't saying we don't want mining, they were saying we want to be treated as a sovereign nation. And for me, Megan, this is the kind of, in a sense, the point that I hope gets taken from the book and taken forward, if you're going to say this is the start of something, and it's really exciting to hear you say that, is that we know these things now as the Bark Petitions, but that is using a word in the English language and a word out of a colonial legal system that was foreign to the Yolngu. And this is why the author's notes explains the title of the book and why it was so important to me that the book had a language title, Näku Dhäruk. Näku Dhäruk was the title given to me by Galarrwuy when I said to him one day when we were in the front seat of the car driving to a funeral, Due, which is the kinship term I use for him, Due, your Yolngu yaku for Bark Petitions. What is the Yolngu word for Bark Petitions? And he had to stop and think about it, and then he said, Näku Dhäruk. Näku is the name of the bark that they're painted on, and Dhäruk means the word or the message. That is very different from a petition.
Yeah.
Okay, a petition implies that there's a subservience involved in it, and your humble petitioners pray. Okay, now that language was given to the Yolngu by Kim Beazley, who came up there as the story rolls out in chronological order through the months of 1963. And I should say, this is written as a narrative. It's just a story. I'm not in it after the introduction and the conclusion. Kim Beazley gave them the Your Petitioners Humbly Pray preamble in order for it to be acceptable to Parliament. But what the Yolngu people thought they were doing was treating between a sovereign Yolngu nation and the sovereign Commonwealth government that they didn't have any idea that they were the servants of or the petitioners of or in any way beholden to. Indigenous people only got voting rights in 1962. 1963 was the first time they were able to exercise them, but it wasn't compulsory to do so. They were not counted in the census until 1967. In the Northern Territory at this time, technically, legally, all Aboriginal people were wards of the state. And so the Yolngu people themselves had no conception of themselves being petitioners. I think that's important as an intellectual concept to take forward into, as you say, the post-referendum era, when we start to think more closely about listening to country, listening to people, listening to First Nation stories, and listening to it in the language that they are using to describe the situation as well, the vernacular.
I think, sorry, I've got the remnants of a cold. I think that's true. I think a few things around the really fascinating history of mining in that space, because when we got back from the rock, we just had this really simplistic argument between pro-mining and not pro-mining. But as you said, and I think this history is really important, the history of the Macassans and their engagement with the Yolngu. My very early career as an academic was on WTO. I teach WTO, World Trade Organization law, and did a lot of work on free trade agreements. And the history of the Yolngu and the Macassan trade is fascinating. Like, that is a part of Australian history. Those trading relationships. I think it's really beautiful the way you deal with that in the book, in that you make the point that people came, the Macassans would come and stay for long periods to do what they needed to do in terms of the sea cucumbers, etc., etc.
Yep.
Never made any claim to the land and went back. And it's a really beautiful explanation of those particular trade agreements. But this idea that, this almost noble savage kind of idea that comes into play, that somehow our people weren't engaged in trade or economic relationships with other people, and that, and particularly I find it very difficult, or I found it difficult in the post-Uluru discussions that, some on the East Coast were like, we are not dealing with those mining companies. We will not, we're anti-mining, but you've got, a very large proportion of our population just having to manage that and deal with that on a daily basis, and for decades and decades and decades, suggests that there's just really poor literacy about how Aboriginal communities have existed and survived, but also the way in which they do business with outsiders.
Yeah, which sort of implies an economic terra nullius as well as a governance terra nullius and an
it's a good way of
agricultural
putting it.
terra nullius, to suggest that Aboriginal people were only ever hunters and gatherers, and this acted on a subsistence level, and they wandered about and took a few berries and ate them when necessary. But you can make a very strong case that our First Nations people were also our first miners. I mean, they were digging shit out of the ground and trading it with other mob who didn't have the shit that they wanted. Ochre, greenstone, other substances, and that had value to them, and they might not have been a European dollar figure value, but they had value because they were required for ceremony, for subsistence in other kinds of ways, and they were traded across boundaries. There's been a lot of research done on trade routes now, and so I think we are getting a lot more information that's coming both from academics who are working in these fields, and there are a lot of terrific archaeologists now who are working in these kinds of areas, and anthropologists. They get a pretty bad rap, probably for good reason. But But there is a lot of really good research that is going on because people are talking to communities.
Yeah.
And they are understanding things from the ground up. And if I can take you back to time, the original idea about time, because this puts me in mind of it. One of the things that I had to grapple with as an historian schooled in the tradition of the Western Enlightenment is that time works in a straight line, that time is linear, that time is teleological, and that time exists to tell a progress development narrative, which very much works in favour of a mining story. And so certainly when they wanted to open up the north, when the Menzies government in the 50s and 60s was opening up the north, what the arguments were on a national basis was that there's actually a Department of Northern Development. That's what it was called, and the idea that we could provide this
resurrected.
Yeah, we could provide this great buffer between Asia and proper Australia by mining the resources of this area in the middle that would provide Australia with these riches. So to undercut that teleological timeline is difficult when you're a storyteller, and also our minds tend to work in chronological order, particularly historians. And we have a narrative mindset of beginning, middle and end. And when I put that to Galarrwuy, I said, where does this story start, Dewey? How do I find the beginning of it? Do I start with the discovery of bauxite in 1958? Do I start with the beginning of the missions in 1935? And then where does it end? Does it end when the petitions were put to Parliament? Does it end when the court case eventually went in 1968? The Yolngu people took the government to court over this, which became the famous Gove land rights case. Does it end in 1976 when the first land rights legislation was passed off the back of the defeat of that legislation, of that court case? Where does it start? Where does it end? And he gave me one of those looks that implied, what a dumb question. You ask such dumb questions. White people ask such dumb questions. And then he eventually said, you just have to look for the clues.
See, I thought that was the most beautiful part of the book.
Yeah.
Because he says to you, you find the clues,
You find the
your way. And I'm like, yeah, that's you're the historian.
Yeah.
That just
you figure it
describes
out.
what historians do.
He said,
I
you
thought.
figure it out. And one of the things that I had to do to figure it out was also work out a narrative strategy. And this is where the book works as literature, I think, but also as kind of an intervention into traditional historical tropes, was finding ways of inserting Yolngu time, which is not a straight line, which is not, which doesn't move in one direction. Yolngu people think, and it took me a long time to figure this out, and it particularly took me reading a book that I recommend to all of you who haven't read it already, called Song Spirals, by the Gaewu group of women, who are a Yolngu, collective of Yolngu sisters in Yirrkala. It won the Prime Minister's Literary Awards a couple of years ago. And what that very much shows is that Yolngu time works in spirals, that they are song spirals, that law, history, philosophy, cosmology is all sung, danced, painted in spirals. The idea of song lines is essentially one that Bruce Chatwin developed.
Yeah, he did. And
that isn't listening to people on country. And so for me, inserting Yolngu time, which the anthropologist Stanner called the everywhen, because past, present and future doesn't exist on a time continuum. It exists in one moment. And to try to narratively interweave Yolngu time with a chronological structure that takes a Western readership through a kind of comforting familiar terrain, January 1963 to December 1963 in 12 neat chapters, then divided into the 3 seasons that Western people would call wet, dry, build-up, but then also divided into the 6 Yolngu seasons by which all progress of time on an annual basis is measured. That became a kind of narrative structure that I hope also reflects the intellectual origins of the story and the people who gave it to me.
That's beautiful. It is...
You can tell me
it
whether
deserves
it
a clap.
worked.
It did work. I thought it was really stunning. I wanted to also ask you about, and you talk about this in your, I am using your author's note a lot to...
Yeah. That's what it's there
Sorry.
for.
That is what it's there for. You talk about Australians struggling to understand. So this is still building upon what is a shameful, in my view, illiteracy of the Australian people about the Bark Petitions, about them always struggling to understand where they fit. Are they a piece of art? Are they? Is it a political statement? I remember when we got back from the Rock and we did Q&A. This is after the Uluru Statement was issued, and we did Q&A in the main hall. And as we walked out to the stage, they had the passage lined with the Bark Petition under, and I thought, Jesus, they know nothing about the Bark Petitions. They put it out because they're like, hey, you did something, this was something, so we're just going to put it in your path. And I remember Noel and Auntie Pat looking at me and going, this tells you that even the people who work with it in Parliament House have no clue about what it means and why it might not have been appropriate to put it out when it was at such a vulnerable stage. But I remember a period where we took the statement to the New South Wales Art Gallery, and we spoke about the political aspect of it, but people just, all they cared about was the painting.
The painting, yeah.
That was it.
Yeah.
And all we got was, you should really give it to a gallery now. You should really have it behind glass. Shouldn't you be using... I mean, we did use white. Like, we had people instructing us at every point of the way, from the people who painted it, about how to manage it, how to treat it. we would send it back to get treated, but everybody was only ever concerned about the painting, but not the Uluru message. Can you talk a bit about that discussion you have in the book where you talk about the way in which Aussies just struggled, for those who understood it or saw it or came across it, just failed to distinguish between art, what they saw as art, and politics. And also, can I just say, it's deeply embedded in it is law.
Yes.
And just that failure to understand that the people that painted it, the painting, the story, it is part of a governance structure that existed well beyond the arrivals.
And the ignorance around that, what to call it. Is it an artwork? Is it a Westminster system document? Is it an object? And you will see when the Bark Petitions, if you do a Google search, there's a lot of misinformation out there.
It's shocking.
There's just so many falsehoods that have been spread. But one of the things you'll see is that even our national institutions don't know what to call it at any one time. And certainly sometimes it's called the Bark Petition, sometimes it's the Petitions. And so there's 2 in Parliament House, there's 1 at the National Museum. And a beautiful, at my launch at the National Museum in Canberra last night, the son of the politician Gordon Bryant, to whom that 3rd Bark Petition had been gifted because of his role in the struggle, the son who had donated that 3rd petition to the National Museum was there in the audience last night. And it was the first time he'd seen it since he donated it many years ago after his parents had passed. Just lovely by the by about this being living history in so many ways. At my launch in Melbourne next week, one of the protagonists in the book, she's my favourite Ngāpuki woman, white woman, Beth Graham, who was a teacher in Yirrkala School in 1963, so an eyewitness to all of this, and she's been an important informer to me. She will be at my launch. She's 93. She'll be there next week. So this is living history, okay? This is not ancient stuff. And certainly all the Yolngu people who I've spoken to, many of them were children. Gullaroo was 15 at the time, but they were all running around while all of this was happening. So the question of what to call it that has stumped people goes right back, I think, to the original moment in which the petition was put to Parliament. So one of the things that I found buried deep in the National Archives in files in Menzies' collection, and they had been unopened since 1963, I know that because I had to apply to have the files open, so I'm the first person to see them. There was a news clipping from the day after the first petition had been presented to Parliament. So it was presented on the 14th of August 1963. So the 15th, there's a news article that has a picture of Jock Nelson, who's the politician who had presented it to Parliament, holding the petition, and that had been stuck onto a piece of paper. And one of the parliamentary press secretaries, the parliamentary secretary for Menzies, had written next to it, "I wonder who thought up this gimmick." So it goes right to the genesis of it, the inability to take it seriously as a gesture of goodwill and good faith, even if they had no capacity to understand it as a form of treaty or engagement, legal engagement between 2 sovereign nations. It wasn't even given the respect of being a petition. It was a gimmick. And that was because of the artwork that surrounds the actual paper petition. So words on paper, and they were in Yolngu and English, a feat that was of great significance, and the first time Yolngu people had used Yolngu written language, which had only been developed by a linguist in the 1950s. It was the first time there had been a written script. They used that, a language they were not literate in themselves, in order to have both languages to say this is an intercultural exchange. We are coming at you using a concept in Yolngu philosophy and political philosophy called balagalili. And balagalili effectively means 2 ways learning. It also means balance. It also means harmony. So what the Yolngu people were attempting to do was to create a situation of harmony, of balance, of 2 ways communication, using 2 languages. and using the traditional and only up until the 1950s way in which to visually communicate words or concepts, not words, concepts, and particularly in this case legal concepts. If you knew how to, if you had have been a politician who was accepting this, or anybody now, if you knew how, you could read the painting. You can read the minchi, the sacred objects. And I'm actually the first person I know, there have been a lot of anthropologists who have trailed up there, but I'm the first person who sat down with Yolngu people and said, can you explain the designs to me? And they were the ones who figured out that this was also the first time that Yolngu people had broken from tens of thousands of years of Yolngu artistic, cosmological, spiritual tradition and not painted in Yiddicha and Dua, which is the two moieties. So everything in Yolngu culture falls into these two moieties. So there are Dua paintings and there are Yiddicha paintings, telling Dua stories and Yiddicha stories. And what I was explained by people like Galaroy and other elders was that these four documents, artworks, petitions, treaties, gifts, I would like to call them gifts, is in the end what I come up with the term for them, these gifts to the Australian nation, they are a combination of Dua and Yiddicha. Because this was, the important thing about that, which was a break with tradition, it was innovative in Yolngu governance terms, was a way of the Yolngu people bringing together their 12 clans of that region in for the first time, a pan-Yolngu identity to understand a common enemy and speak to what they saw as a common enemy, or potentially what they thought of as a common collaborator. And so that was Yolngu people innovating, not being Stone Age people stuck in the past, but actually innovating to look forward to what they felt was the future coming at them. And the future coming at them was that they had to strengthen as a political nation, sorry to use the term, one nation. They had to make Northeast Arnhem Land great again.
I'm just thinking of the hat.
Yeah, there's a lot of letters there.
I know we're coming up to time. Claire, I love historians. I mean, when I think about the post-Uluru environment and where truth-telling is taking us, you know, our team's been talking a lot, including the Uluru team, about, you know, what could we have done better? What could we, you know, and I mean, you know, it was a pretty tough campaign, so we're not going to stand on a hill and say, hey, we did everything wrong. But
so many things I want to say to that, but
no. But one of the things we did reflect upon is in the next phase, as we move forward with our 6.2 million friends, is to think about the way we talk about our culture and engage with non-Indigenous Australia. And we've been doing a little bit of work with some of the guys at Berkeley who do a lot of work on what they call belonging and othering. And one of their key leaders said to me, that was tough what you guys went through because of the huge misinformation, and it was tough. I think when we say we felt like we were standing outside of it, watching it, but he said to me, but we can all do better. And so they put it to the Black Lives Matter movement that they probably should have said Black Lives Matter too, TOO. And he said it was a big conference room in Atlanta, like 10,000 people. They split the room. Half were like, nah, you know, walking out angry. And the other half went, oh, okay. But he said to me, I'll put this to you. Always was, always will be. You'll never win a referendum on that motto. And I remember just being really confronted and angry at first, and then going away and thinking, okay, we have to do things to shift as well. But I have to say that when people think about truth-telling in Australia and history and how we talk to non-Indigenous Australia about their history, truth commissions aren't going to get us there. But Australian historians will get us there. And that's why I think this is the beginning of that. Because this book is so beautiful, and especially the way you set it up. You know, there might be some people that say, oh, it's activist, oh, it should have been a black fella, oh, but no, reading your history, the story of how you came to this story. I haven't told you yet, but my first time at Garma was the same year as yours.
Oh, true?
Yeah.
2010,
Yeah.
there.
It's so creepy.
Wow.
And we've never discussed this.
There's a kind of sliding door
There's
moment.
so much. We didn't know each other.
No.
And it wasn't until, you know, Adelaide, I think it was, Writers' Festival, where we really came to know each other. But, you know, it was Gallaroy, it was you, it was his family. This is, when you read it, you can see the winds of history blowing through the book, and all the different, the serendipity, the coincidences, everything is extraordinary to bring this book to the Australian people, which, you know, we got a bit of a job to do to get them interested in this. But our most recent research shows that they did not understand the Uluru Statement from the Heart. They haven't read it. This is after the fact, no voters. They didn't know it came from the Australian people, the Aboriginal people. They did not know we came up with Voice. They do not know about this story. And, you know, we look positive at the outcome and say we have 6.2 million friends that we didn't know that we had. But we've also got a starting point, which is this huge lack of knowledge about not just civics or literacy, but a lack of knowledge about Australian history, their own history. And all, so you talked about the element of consultation and dialogue. People used to say, oh, the Voice is just a advisory body, it's nothing. I'm like, no, it's protocol. It's the same as Welcome to Country. You know, the referendum vote wasn't to say no more Welcome to Country. This is how Australians identify themselves. I'm identifying myself to you because I live on this First Nations land. And I was born on this I work on this First Nations land. And so that notion of coming onto someone's country and mining their country, making decisions about that with not even talking to those people is a really important thing. And all of that was lost in all of that debate last year.
And even for people to understand that, you know, last year was the 60th anniversary of the presentation of the Bark Petitions. What the Bark Petitions essentially called for was a voice, which is another way of saying consultation, which is where it fits into the trilogy, the democracy trilogy. So essentially how that works is that it's a trilogy based on the material heritage of Australian democracy. The Eureka flag, the women's suffrage banner, which is just a stone's throw from the Bark Petitions in Parliament House, and then the Bark Petitions, effectively a way of understanding the expansion of the franchise, or who the idea of the Australian people are, who the body politic are, to incorporate workers' rights, women's rights and First Nations rights. All of these things were material items. I make the argument that Australian democracy is handmade. These are material objects that were made by people on the ground to raise the claim that we are here on this land and our voices must be heard. We must be counted. And that principle applies to miners on the goldfield, to women at the turn of the 20th century, and to First Nations people in the 1960s, for which this is the precursor to the 67 referendums, to the freedom rides, and then to many of the other civil rights, the Tent Embassy and ASIC, and then, and then rolls on into the 80s. And so that idea of having a voice, what I hope that might be taken by readers, I think will get it, and potentially an intelligent media might get the idea that voice is not something that is an exclusive demand of First Nations people. That is kind of this kind of, well, we want to be heard too. You know, what about us? What about us? What about me? Which is part of what I think happened in the referendums, which was unlike the 67 referendum, where there was an argument for, well, First Nations people clearly didn't have these rights. They didn't have the right to be counted in the Constitution. So it was like they were going for equal rights. What Australians managed to be scared into believing was that First Nations people were going to get something else, something added, something that other people didn't have. So that could feed into a kind of grievance that underlies Trumpism, and that is a geopolitical phenomenon worldwide that's we see coming out in Europe in different ways. But what I hope this, as in a kind of historical perspective, does is show that this concept of voice is fundamental to the democracy that we say that we love and cherish, and like in Australia, to say that we are world leaders in, and that we are a democratic nation, and we're proud of our democratic heritage and roots. Well, that is all about voice. And so this is the next historical piece of the puzzle. And then where I go to, as you know, in the conclusion, when I put my historian's hat back on and stop talking in the voice of the characters, in a sense, and on the heels of the action, and then sort of condense 60 years into an epilogue, is to say the next step of that, the next piece of the puzzle, what would make a trilogy into a, what's it called, quartet, would be the Uluru Statement, which also, as you've suggested, is a document, a gift, a treat that is understood and dismissed as being something, as a decorative piece of art that you can hang on the wall or put in the cupboard, and that would be the next, that could fundamentally be the next piece of that story, which I gesture towards, but don't, of course, attempt to tell that story.
And I know that you raised that some people could claim this was an activist book, but it's not. It's the book that we needed to have after that loss, because so many. So Progressive No, for example, would say, we want a treaty. And I'd be like, but we've been asking for a voice or a role in Australian democracy, a more pronounced and predictable mandated role in decision-making about us, decades before treaty even became a part of our discourse. Treaty, in fact, was only ever done internationally by 3 countries. They're all British Crown countries, Canada, New Zealand, the US, and we've all been tricked into thinking it's the way most of the world manages Indigenous, or not manages, I shouldn't use that word, but accommodates, shouldn't use that word either, you get but
negotiates with
Aboriginal people in their democracies. But actually, if you look across the world, the bulk of liberal democracies deal with people by Aboriginal people by providing them with some kind of voice. And I think that's important. But when I gave the speech in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I was standing up there talking about Yolngu as the great law reformers in this country, who pioneered so many ideas. They've done strategic litigation, they've done diplomacy through the parliament. It's extraordinary, their achievements, and so few Australians know about it. This book should, I would hope, contribute to that gap in the knowledge that the nation has, that actually the voice is a really old idea. We've got some early 1800 documentation that shows First Nations people calling for a voice in colonial parliaments.
And what I'm also suggesting, if you can read the 3 books together, is that idea of voice and the struggle for that voice, which was decades old, is what got women the vote. So every woman who was sitting in this room today got a voice because people struggled to convince a parliament, and they needed allies to do that, and those allies were men, because they are the only ones who are in parliament who did have a governance voice. They had to convince them that to pass legislation that would give them a voice. And now we take for granted that voice, that we have that voice. It doesn't seem scary. I mean, obviously there are a contingent of dinosaur men who do think women's voices are scary and would like to silence them. But we don't now consider that to be this kind of radical, the sky is going to fall, which was the argument that was put, and the book shows that. That the argument of the anti-suffragists was that this was going to destroy the social fabric of society if women got the vote. It would be end of marriage. That it would be that no women would have any children anymore. That they would become manly man. That horns would grow out of their heads. Like these were all the images that were. This is the kind of demonization of this idea, and it's the same thing. Like we see this same trope being played out in the Voice referendum campaign last year, with the idea that it's going to, or even Mabo did it, take people's backyards. That they're going to. That these kind of crazy notions that this is going to be, here's the wrenching in the social fabric. How many times was the word "the voice will be divisive" come up? Like that was the main argument that was perpetrated against it, that it was going to divide Aussies.
Yeah.
This is the same argument that was used against suffrage. I mean, this is what I hope historians can do, and what reading across this trilogy can do, is join some of these dots. And then maybe if you can join the dots and show this historical context, you can also persuade people to not be so scared of implications, to see that things that now seem natural were once terrifying to people. And the other thing is, and that they had to be struggled for. They had to be fought for. And this is, you've said of the kind of the detail of the book and the showing how the kind of the drama in motion, the decisions that were made, the choices that were made by people in the time, the sliding doors moments. This is what I also try to do in that narrative sense, is to show that we are all making decisions every day of our lives. We are making choices about what we're going to do, what we're going to support, what we're going to look at, what we are going to turn away from. At this particular time in the war in Gaza, where a lot of us are looking at, what are we looking at? What are we prepared to turn away from? What are we prepared to call out? What are we prepared to be silent about? These are the choices that people throughout history have made in their daily lives. And this is why I kind of follow our characters through their daily lives, because their lives are not that different ultimately from our lives, because we are making choices about what we do, where we're going to put our energies, what we're going to support. And ultimately, every day we are making history.
I know we're getting a bit of a jog along.
I think we are.
I mean, I think what's important probably to end on is when people say, and Dr. Yunupingu was a big part of this process. Him, Noel Pearson and myself were the only Aboriginal people on all of the committees set up for this work, and he was a big part of it, including, as you write in the book, allowing us to use the word Makarrata, perhaps not in its traditional sense, but in the sense of coming together after a dispute. And because Makarrata fits so much better than this notion of reconciliation, which in the dialogues we heard most of our people reject. It's not the right word because we've never met. We are not friends, so we're not reconciling. But we need our own Australian framework, not something imported from South Africa or Canada. We need an Australian framework, which was at the heart of the Uluru Statement. But we adopted a dialogue approach, and after all of that work over 2 years, people adopted the Voice as the main framework. We came back from the Rock, and everyone said you got it wrong. Complete zero respect for self-determination, and you get to the referendum, and there's this media frenzy. Nobody, a lot of people saying, "Oh, we're not supporting. It's going to cede our sovereignty." All of the no stuff, and then you get to the aftermath, and what happens? We find out that the bulk of Aboriginal people voted yes. We were led to believe they didn't support it, and then the data shows, I think, is it 19 of the 20 ballot boxes in the Northern Territory voted yes. Some of the most remote communities had voted yes in 80, 85, 90% yes. Huge, overwhelming yes vote in those electorates across urban areas that had large Aboriginal populations. For us, our people voted yes they showed, they exercised their voice and they voted yes. But particularly in the Northern Territory, it was an overwhelming yes vote.
One of the details that about voting patterns in the Northern Territory that distresses me the most is that in Northeast Arnhem Land, in that remote polling station, the Yirrkala booths were, I think, over 90% yes. In the Nhulunbuy booths, so Nhulunbuy is the white mining town that was built in the 1970s following the fact that Yolngu were not able to stop that process or be consulted. And then the mining leases were granted, the court case failed, and then the town went ahead. So there's a mining town there that was built in the 70s. There's schools, there's shops, there's a pub, a town of about 4,000 people, substantially, like big no vote. Okay, so these are the people you would think live in close proximity to Aboriginal people, who see them every day, who interact in some way. And one would hope that, you know, there's that other statistic that only 3% of Australian people have ever knowingly interacted with an Aboriginal person. You would hope that in an environment like that, they would see what on the ground operates and how a voice might help that. But that was a massive no in the white community.
Yeah, yeah, it's extraordinary. And which leads me to my last point, and then I'll shut up. Because I think for me, and as I said, every single person who launches your book will come at it from different perspectives, and I'm a lawyer and a public lawyer, and I see it through that lens. But
I want to say, and I love lawyers. Like you said, I love historians.
Did you hear that, Justin? She loves us.
I love constitutional lawyers.
She does. She really does. But just in the pioneering spirit of, and the speech that I did in New York was about these gun law reformers, yeah? And they never give up. They just keep going and going and going in all different ways. But their most recent case before the High Court, which we won't know about for a little bit, is about, it comes under the provision in the Constitution about the acquisition of Aboriginal title without just terms, which is a big kind of actual time bomb, I think, for the nation. There's been a lot of...
Which is why the government is appealing the court's decision in this.
Yeah, I mean, Dreyfus announced it just in the lead up to the referendum, and we said, there's no way you guys can go to Gama after what you've done.
So this is a case that involves Galarrwuy taking on the Crown, the Commonwealth government, for compensation for... Bye, Charlotte. For compensation for the loss of lands and subsequent devastation in all sorts of areas. And the court that it was first heard in, was it the Northern Territory, I think?
Federal Court.
The Federal Court, sorry. The Federal Court found in the Yolngu's favour, found in Dr. Yunupingu's favour. And so the federal government is now appealing against that to the High Court. So that's the background of that if you haven't followed it.
But I think what's important about that case and about what I think has been a lot of cases, not enough, probably a lot more cases where I think Aboriginal people are rightly taking the Crown or the Commonwealth to court for acquiring their property without just terms, is this fundamental rule of law issue. And I know Australians don't like to talk about it, but this is a story of where the rule of law doesn't apply to Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities. And it's a conversation that we need to have in our schools and in our communities, because it's a very real thing. And it's not just limited to land and native title, but it applies to youth detention and the unlawful conduct of officers in those institutions. It applies to Aboriginal child removals, where in my New South Wales inquiry I found that the bulk of the judges involved with removal applications didn't look at the evidence that the caseworkers had put up. But if you looked at the evidence that the caseworkers put up, like we did, the bulk of those children were removed unlawfully. They found the same in Queensland under the Carmody inquiry. caseworkers and courts working together to have children removed without any evidence as to why these children should be removed. Because many, many caseworkers just lie to the court and nobody checks their work. This issue of where the law doesn't apply properly and equally and lawfully and formally to Aboriginal people in a way that would benefit them is a real serious problem in this country. And I think the case that, I mean, maybe you'll write a little bit more once we see what that case looks like at the tail end. But what an extraordinary case they've brought, appealed to the High Court, but it's an extraordinary story of a group of people, a mob, a nation, stepping up to another nation and saying, we're not going to take this, this is unlawful, and we're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing until you make room for us in your democracy and you apply your law, especially your constitution, fairly to us.
And I guess that goes to the point that I was saying earlier about time and about where does it start, where does it end. So this book had to come to an end because my editor would have flailed me if it was any longer than it is.
It's quite hefty.
Yeah.
In good ways, good ways.
You said you read it in 2 days. Megan
I
said
did.
she read it in 2 days.
It was.
All right. This
I
woman
was
doesn't sleep.
enthralled.
But,
No, it's a...
yes, it is. It's a page
I'm not
turner.
sure everybody will though.
My point is that
I didn't mean that.
apart from my editor not allowing me to continue the narrative any longer and it having to come to an end, it's a story that has not ended. It is a story that is open-ended and it is a live issue right now because the same person who was 15 when the Bark Petitions went to Parliament and who sat in on the select committee inquiries and listened to those first politicians who came and heard the voices of Yolngu people and tell that story in there, that same person is the one who is the appellant in this High Court case now.
Extraordinary. And a perfect way to end our yarn. Thanks the wonderful, beautiful Clare Wright.